He hadn't heard it in 11 years. And the second it reached him across the marble floor of the Aldrich Hotel in Manhattan, his entire body stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. Like a man who has just stepped onto ice and understood, in the half-second before the fall, that the ground beneath him is no longer what he believed it to be. Caruso stood in the corridor outside the hotel's private dining room, one tattooed hand raised at his side, mid-sentence, the words dying in his throat before they could reach the two men beside him who waited with the patience of people who had learned that when Caruso stopped, you stopped too, and you did not ask why. Because no one asked Caruso why. Not in New York. Not anywhere on the eastern seaboard. Not if they wanted to wake up the following morning with all the same things they had gone to sleep with. He was 30 years old and he had built the kind of silence around himself that most men spend their entire lives attempting and never achieving. The Caruso name did not appear in newspapers. It did not appear in court documents. It lived in the mouths of people who spoke it carefully, in rooms with closed doors, in the specific tone reserved for things that were dangerous and true. He wore a dark charcoal suit that had been cut to his measurements by a tailor in Connecticut who asked no questions. His dark hair was pushed back from a face that was all clean jaw and controlled expression. The tattoos on his neck and across both hands were the only decoration he permitted himself, and even those were deliberate, geometric, precise, nothing ornamental. He was not a man who did anything for show. Everything Caruso did had a reason. Which was why the two men beside him understood, in the particular way that people understand things they are not going to be told directly, that what had just stopped him in this corridor was not a security threat, not a rival, not any of the ordinary things that required their attention. It was a sound. Coming from behind the service door to their left. A piano. Specifically, the first 4 bars of a Neapolitan folk song that had not existed in Caruso's world for 11 years, 3 months, and a number of days he had stopped counting because counting had not helped and he was not a sentimental man. He was not a sentimental man. He told himself this regularly. It was important. The service door was plain and unmarked the way all service doors in expensive hotels are plain and unmarked, invisible to guests, visible only to the people who kept the world running from its unseen side. Caruso pushed it open. The room behind it was a small staging area, the kind hotels use for equipment storage, and it connected through an open internal arch to a side room where an upright piano sat against the wall, older than everything else in the building, slightly out of place, the kind of piano that had survived several renovations by being too heavy to move conveniently. And sitting at it, her back to him, was a young woman in a plain white shirt and dark trousers, the uniform of the hotel's catering staff. She was not performing. She was not aware of anyone watching. She was simply playing, her head tilted slightly to the right the way people tilt when they are playing something they learned so long ago their hands know it without instruction, something they carry in their body rather than their memory. She played the 4 bars again. Then 8. Then 16. And every single note arrived in Caruso's chest with the precision of something that knew exactly where it was going because it had been there before. He did not move. He stood in the doorway of the service entrance to a staging room in the Aldrich Hotel in Manhattan at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, and for the first time in 11 years, Caruso felt something he had specifically and deliberately arranged his entire life to never feel again. If this opening moved something in you, subscribe right now and hit the bell, because what happens next is the part nobody sees coming. Her name was Vera. Vera Osei. 26 years old, Ghanaian-American, the daughter of a woman who had worked 2 jobs in Washington, D.C. for 18 years so that Vera could study music at Georgetown, which Vera had done, graduating with a degree she was enormously proud of and which had, in the 3 years since, proven almost entirely useless in the specific financial sense of the word. She was not bitter about this. Vera was constitutionally resistant to bitterness, which was either a great strength or a significant character flaw depending on the day. She worked catering events at the Aldrich Hotel 4 nights a week, set up and broke down equipment for private dining functions, carried things that were too heavy and smiled at people who did not see her and went home at 2 in the morning on the subway to a shared apartment in Brooklyn where she paid her portion of the rent and ate breakfast standing at the kitchen counter and practiced piano on a $60 folding keyboard she kept beside her bed. She played the old piano in the staging room because she had discovered it 6 months ago during a late breakdown shift and had understood immediately that no one else knew it was there. The hotel's maintenance records listed it as decommissioned. It had no function. It was simply present, patient, waiting in the way that old instruments wait, not urgently, but with the specific confidence of something that knows it will eventually be found. Vera played it on nights when her shift ended early and the building was quiet and she had 40 minutes before the last subway. She played the things she loved, the things she had learned as a child, the things her mother's neighbor Mrs. Addo had taught her on an old upright exactly like this one in a row house in Washington, D.C. on Saturday afternoons while the smell of jollof rice came through from the kitchen and the afternoon light moved across the floor. She did not know that the song she was currently playing, the one she had learned from a recording Mrs. Addo kept on a scratched CD she said came from an old friend in Brooklyn, a song Mrs. Addo called simply the Harbor Song. She did not know it belonged to anyone in particular. She did not know it had a history outside Mrs. Addo's small living room. She did not know that 11 years earlier, a woman named Rosa Caruso had played it on a piano in a Brooklyn apartment every Sunday morning while her son sat at the kitchen table and did not say that he loved her because he was 19 and did not yet understand that love had an expiration that arrived without warning. Vera did not know any of this. She simply played. And Caruso stood in the doorway and listened until the song ended, and then he did something that no one who worked for him had ever seen him do in 11 years of watching him operate. He waited. He did not announce himself. He did not step forward. He stood in the doorway of a storage room in a hotel he essentially owned through 3 layers of untraceable holding companies and he waited for a catering employee to finish playing a dead woman's song on a decommissioned piano. When the last note faded, Vera sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. Then she heard him. Not a sound, exactly, more a change in the quality of the silence behind her, the specific difference between a room that is empty and a room that contains someone who has been standing very still. She turned. He was standing in the doorway in a dark suit with tattoos on his neck and hands and an expression she could not read, which was unsettling because Vera had always been good at reading expressions. It was one of the things music training had given her. He was looking at her the way she had seen people look at photographs of people who were no longer alive. Not with longing. With recognition. "Who taught you that?" he said. His voice was low and absolutely level, the voice of a man who had removed every unnecessary thing from the way he spoke. It was not a threatening question. But the specific quality of his stillness when he asked. It made Vera understand, without being told, that the answer mattered in a way she did not yet have the information to understand. She told him the truth. "An old woman in D.C., she said. A neighbor." He nodded once. Very slowly. "What was her name?" he said. And that was only the beginning. Caruso did not return to his dinner. His 2 men waited in the corridor for 11 minutes before Victor, 53 years old, silver-haired, black, the only person alive who had worked beside Caruso for more than a decade and still possessed all the same things he had started with, knocked quietly on the service door and said that the Chicago delegation was asking. Caruso told him to apologize and reschedule. Victor absorbed this information with the specific expressionlessness of a man who had long ago understood that his job was not to interpret instructions but to execute them, and he went back through the door and did exactly that. Inside the staging room, Vera had not moved from the piano bench. Not because she was afraid. She had assessed Caruso in the first 30 seconds, the suit, the tattoos, the quality of stillness, the way the hotel's corridor had been conspicuously empty of other guests in the direction he had come from, and she had constructed an approximate picture of who she was speaking to that was more accurate than most people would have managed. She was not afraid because fear, in Vera's experience, was only useful when it prompted action, and since she had not yet determined what action was available to her, she had set fear aside in the practical way she set aside everything that was not immediately useful. She was, however, deeply and specifically curious. Because the way he had looked at her when she was playing was not the way a dangerous man looks at a threat. It was the way a person looks at something they had believed was gone. Caruso sat down in the chair against the wall, 3 feet from the piano, and he was quiet for long enough that Vera understood the quiet was intentional. He was deciding how much to say, not whether to say it. Finally he said that the neighbor's name was Mrs. Addo, that she had been his mother's closest friend, that they had come from the same village on the Neapolitan coast and arrived in New York in the same year and lived 3 blocks apart in Brooklyn for 22 years. Vera looked at him. "Mrs. Addo had moved to D.C. 13 years ago," she said. "After something happened." He nodded. "Something happened," he said. And the way he said those 2 words, flat, factual, stripped of the emotional content that the words were obviously standing in for, told Vera more than any elaboration could have. She did not push it. She had a musician's instinct for rests. For the notes that are not played. His mother had taught him this song, Caruso said. On a piano in their apartment in Brooklyn on Sunday mornings. She played it without sheet music because she had learned it as a child and it lived in her hands the way things do when they are learned early enough. He looked at the piano, not at Vera, while he said this. His hands were resting on his thighs, the tattoos across his knuckles catching the low staging room light. He said his mother's name had been Rosa. He said it the way people say the names of the dead, with a very small pause before and after, as if the name requires its own space in the sentence. He said she had died 11 years ago when he was 19. He said he had not heard the song since. Vera was quiet. She understood now why the question of what was her name had mattered in the way it mattered, and she felt the particular weight of having played a dead woman's music into the ears of her son without knowing it, and she sat with that weight for a moment because it deserved to be sat with. Then she said, "Mrs. Addo never told me whose song it was. She just said it came from Brooklyn and it deserved to be remembered." Caruso looked at her for a long moment. Vera held the look without looking away, because she was a woman who had learned that looking away was a form of diminishment she was not willing to offer. He said Mrs. Addo was right. And then he stood, buttoned his jacket with the single precise gesture of a man returning himself to his public form, and said he would not keep her. He was at the door when Vera said, without planning to say it, "She played it differently than you remember, didn't she?" He stopped. His hand on the door frame. His back to her. A long silence stretched across the small room. Then, without turning, he said, "Yes." Slower. She said it made it sound like something ending. He said his mother played it like something beginning. He left. And Vera sat at the piano in the empty staging room and played the 4 opening bars again, this time slowly, and listened to what it sounded like when it meant something different than she had known. He told himself he was not coming back. This was on a Friday. By the following Thursday, he was back. He had not specifically decided to return to the Aldrich Hotel staging room. He had scheduled a meeting with a Connecticut real estate contact in the hotel's private dining room, which was a legitimate business requirement with no other motivation attached to it, and if the meeting happened to end at 10:45 in the evening, which was approximately when the hotel's late catering shifts concluded, this was a coincidence. Caruso was a man who did not believe in coincidences and therefore was not troubled by engineering them. Vera was at the piano. She was playing something different this time, a Ghanaian highlife melody her mother had sung during the drives between Washington and New York when Vera was small, something bright and rhythmic that filled the small room with a warmth entirely out of proportion with the size of the space. She heard him before she turned this time. She had been listening for him, which she did not examine too closely because the examination would have led somewhere she was not ready to go. She turned and looked at him in the doorway and said, "You came back." He said he had a meeting in the building. She said, "Of course." He said nothing to that. He came in and sat in the same chair against the wall and Vera turned back to the piano and kept playing. This was something neither of them had decided, that he would sit and she would play and they would spend time in the same room without the performance of conversation, and yet it happened with the naturalness of things that were always going to happen. He listened. Vera played for 20 minutes, moving through the highlife melody, then a Chopin nocturne she had been working on for a year, then, without making a decision about it, the Harbor Song. She felt the quality of his attention change when she moved into it. Not visibly, he did not move, did not make a sound, but the room shifted in the way rooms shift when someone in them is receiving something rather than simply hearing it. She finished all 4 verses. The last note faded. She said, "Your mother's version." He said, "Yes." She said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because that's how it sounds when it's beginning and not ending." Vera turned on the bench and looked at him and something in the room settled, the way pressure settles after a storm passes. She asked him what his mother had been like and she watched the question arrive in his face in layers, first the instinct to deflect, which lived on the surface, then something older and more involuntary beneath it, a man who had been asked something true by someone who genuinely wanted to know the answer. He said she was small. He said she laughed easily. He said she had very strong opinions about bread and would walk 40 minutes each way to a specific bakery in Carroll Gardens rather than buy the bread from the shop on their corner, and that he had thought this was eccentric until after she was gone and he had found himself, on 3 separate occasions across 11 years, walking distances that made no practical sense because the ordinary option was not the right one. He said she played piano every Sunday morning and she sang while she played, and she was not a particularly technically accomplished singer, but she sang like someone who was doing it for the room and not for any audience. He said she had called him Renato when she wanted him to sit still for something. His name was not Renato. It had never been Renato. He did not explain this. He did not need to. Vera looked at him and she saw, in the careful way she looked at everything, the way musicians look, the way people who have learned to listen for what is underneath the note look, a 19-year-old boy who had lost the person who called him by a name that was not his name, and had spent 11 years building something so large and so defended around that loss that the loss itself had become invisible. She said, "What did she call the song?" He said she had no name for it. She just played it. Like it didn't need one. And Vera understood then that she was the only person who had heard that song since Rosa Caruso died, which meant she was the only person alive who had given that song back to the man who needed it most without knowing she was doing it, and the weight of that was enormous and quiet and entirely hers to carry from this point forward. She turned back to the piano. She played the Harbor Song one more time. And this time, Caruso closed his eyes. 3 weeks passed. Then 4. The meetings at the Aldrich became a Thursday fixture so consistent that Victor stopped asking whether he would be attending other engagements first and simply cleared the evening. Vera's shifts ended at 10:30. By 10:55, Caruso was usually in the chair against the wall. They had not discussed this arrangement. It had simply arrived, the way things arrive between two people when both of them are paying enough attention to let something happen without forcing it. Vera learned things about him in the way she learned music, slowly, by repetition, by attending to what changed between one version and the next. She learned that he took his coffee black and too hot in a way that suggested he had never particularly cared about the temperature and had been drinking it scalding for so long that his palate had simply adjusted. She learned that he was meticulous about punctuality in a way that had nothing to do with ego and everything to do with a deep, structural respect for other people's time. She learned that he had read more than she expected, not fashionable books, not books for display, but history, architecture, specific dense texts about subjects he was interested in for no reason except the interest itself. She learned that he had been to the Brooklyn apartment once since his mother died, exactly once, on the day he signed the paperwork transferring it to a new owner, and had stood in the empty space where the piano had been and not allowed himself to stand there long enough to feel it, which was the only version of that moment he had been capable of surviving. She learned all of this not because he volunteered it but because she asked questions and he answered them because she asked the way people ask when they are not collecting information but extending genuine attention, and genuine attention was something Caruso had not been offered in so long that when it arrived he did not immediately recognize what it was. Caruso learned things about her too. He learned about Georgetown, about the folding keyboard beside her bed, about her mother Abina who called every Sunday evening from Washington D.C. with the specific certainty that Vera was not eating properly, which was accurate. He learned about Mrs. Addo, who was 81 now and still in D.C., still in the same row house, still with the scratched CD of songs she said came from Brooklyn and deserved to be remembered. He learned that Vera had a habit of pressing her thumb against the edge of the piano keys when she was thinking through something difficult, running it along the white keys without pressing, the sound of thinking made visible. He learned that she was funnier than she initially appeared and that her humor was the dry, quiet kind that arrived sideways and took a moment to register, and that when she laughed it was sudden and complete, nothing held back, nothing performed, and that the first time he had caused that laugh he had felt something shift in the architecture of his chest in a way he had no formula for. One Thursday, he arrived to find her not at the piano. She was sitting on the floor against the wall with her back to the piano, her knees pulled up, a photograph in her hands. She did not hear him enter. He stood in the doorway and saw her looking at the photograph with the specific expression of a person who is not looking at a picture but at a time. He recognized the expression because he owned a version of it. He sat down on the floor beside her. Not too close. She showed him the photograph without him asking for it. It was Mrs. Addo and a woman standing in front of a building, young, both of them, a Brooklyn street visible behind them. The woman beside Mrs. Addo had a smile that was familiar in a way Vera could not explain and had been thinking about since she found the photograph tucked inside the piano bench that evening, slipped between the wood and the felt lining as if someone had placed it there intentionally, or as if it had simply lived there for years, waiting. Caruso looked at the photograph. His jaw tightened by a degree too small to measure. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "That's my mother." Vera said she knew. He looked at her. She said, She has your eyes. And something in Caruso's face moved in the way faces move when they receive something they did not know they were waiting to receive, a fact, simple and true, that connects the living to the dead in a way nothing else can. He reached out and took the photograph, very carefully, as if it were something that required permission to be held, and he looked at his mother's face in a Brooklyn street in a year before he existed, young and laughing beside a woman who had kept her memory alive in a row house in Washington, D.C. for 22 years by teaching her songs to a girl who would one day carry them to a staging room in Manhattan and play them back to her son. He held the photograph for a long time. Vera sat beside him and did not speak and did not move away. And the staging room was very quiet and very still, and outside the Aldrich Hotel, Manhattan continued its enormous indifferent noise, and inside, two people sat on the floor beside a decommissioned piano and no one disturbed them and nothing was required of either of them except to be present. That was enough. That was more than enough. The morning Caruso flew to D.C. was a Tuesday in early December. He told no one the reason. He told Victor a location and a time and Victor drove him to the airport without questions, which was the only kind of driver Caruso had ever employed. The row house in Washington, D.C. was on a quiet street with a maple tree out front that had lost its leaves and stood bare against a gray morning sky, and the house itself was small and neat with a light on in the front window at 9 in the morning because Mrs. Addo had always kept a light on, Vera had told him, ever since she moved to D.C., ever since the thing that happened in Brooklyn, because she said she wanted anyone who needed a light to be able to find one. He knocked. Mrs. Addo answered the door with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had opened it 10,000 times and expected nothing from the 10,001st time that would require her to adjust her pace. She was 81, small, her silver hair pinned neatly, wearing a house dress the color of ochre. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice that was steady and warm and carried the specific weight of someone who had been waiting for a version of this moment for 11 years, "You look like her." He said, "I know." She opened the door wider and said, "Come in." He went inside. He sat in a small bright living room with photographs on every surface, and he recognized his mother in 3 of them before he had finished sitting down. Mrs. Addo brought tea he did not ask for and sat in the chair across from him with her hands folded in her lap and looked at him with the eyes of a woman who had decided some time ago that she was done being indirect about important things. She told him everything. Not everything in the sense of every detail, but everything in the sense of every truth that mattered. She told him that Rosa had telephoned her the week before she died, had said she was worried about Caruso, about who he was becoming, about the world he was building himself into, and that she had asked Mrs. Addo to remember her the right way, not to the city, not to anyone official, but to him, someday, if the day ever arrived when someone who loved him could carry the memory back. She said she had kept the CD for that reason. She said she had taught the song to Vera without fully knowing why, only that she had felt it was the right thing to do, the way she had often felt things were the right thing to do without being able to explain the mechanism. She said she believed some things found their way home through people rather than through roads. Caruso sat with that for a long time. Then he asked, did she give the song a name? Mrs. Addo smiled. She said Rosa had called it by the name their village used for it in the dialect of her grandmother's generation. It meant, roughly translated, the thing that remains. Caruso looked at his hands, the tattooed hands that had built an empire on the eastern seaboard, the hands that had signed things he would not discuss and given orders he would not repeat. He looked at them for a long time. Then he asked if he could see the CD. Mrs. Addo brought it. He held the scratched, taped-together case and looked at the handwriting on the inside of the cover, his mother's handwriting, which he had not seen in 11 years, looping and slanted the way she had always written, her name in the corner with the date, 2003, 2 years before she died. He sat in Mrs. Addo's living room for 2 hours. They talked about Rosa, the bread she had been particular about, the way she laughed, the opinions she held without apology, the piano she played every Sunday morning, the songs she performed not for any audience but for the room. When Caruso left, Mrs. Addo pressed the CD into his hands and said it belonged with him. He drove back to the airport in a car that smelled of Mrs. Addo's tea and the specific cold of a Washington, D.C. morning in December, and he sat in the departure lounge and did not look at his phone for the first time in 11 years and simply sat with everything the morning had given him. He was back in New York by evening. He went to the Aldrich Hotel. It was not Thursday. Vera was not scheduled to be there. She was there anyway, at the piano, because she had received no message and had no reason to expect him and had simply arrived because it had become the place she came when she needed to think, which was the only honest explanation she had. He came through the service door and she turned and looked at him and saw immediately that something had changed in the architecture of his face, not dramatically, not the way visible things change, but in the underlying way, the structural way, the way a building changes when the tension in one of its load-bearing walls is released. He sat down in the chair. He set the CD case on the piano beside her without explanation. She looked at it, at his mother's handwriting, at the date. She looked at him. He said, "She called it the thing that remains." Vera said nothing. She turned back to the piano. She placed her hands on the keys. She began to play the harbor song from the beginning, slowly, the way Mrs. Addo had always played it, and she played it all the way through without stopping, every note, every verse, every quiet space between the phrases where his mother had breath before continuing. When she finished, the staging room was completely still. Caruso sat in the chair against the wall and his hands were in his lap and his eyes were open and he was not performing any expression at all, which was the rarest thing Vera had ever seen in a human face. She did not turn around immediately. She gave him the time. Then she heard him say, very quietly, in a voice so stripped of everything except the truth of what it was carrying, "Thank you." She turned. He was looking at her, not the way he had looked at her the first night, with the shock of recognition, not the way he had looked at the photograph, with the grief of the irretrievable. He was looking at her the way people look at something that has become necessary. Quietly. Completely. Without apology. Vera looked back at him with the same quality of attention. The staging room held them both for a moment that had no defined length. Then she said, "She would have liked that you came back for it." He said, "I know." And that was all. That was everything. Neither of them said the word that lived underneath all of it, the word that had been building in the space between them across 5 weeks of Thursday evenings and one Tuesday morning in Washington, D.C. and a song that meant the thing that remains. Neither of them needed to. Some things do not need to be named to be true. Some things survive exactly because they are carried quietly, in the hands of people who understand that the most important things are not announced. They are simply present. The way music is present in a room even after it ends. The way a mother is present in a song even after she is gone. The way the harbor song was present in a staging room on the 17th floor of the Aldrich Hotel in Manhattan, played on a decommissioned piano by a woman who had not known what she was carrying until the night a man stopped in a doorway and heard something he had believed was buried come back to him across the marble floor. And if you have ever lost something and believed it was gone forever, if you have ever stood in a room and heard something that reached inside you and found a door you had locked a long time ago, then you know exactly what Caruso felt that night. And you know why he stayed. If this story moved you the way I believe it did, please subscribe and hit the notification bell right now so you never miss a Mafia Hidden Tale story. Share it with someone who needs to hear that the things we lose have a way of finding us back. And tell me in the comments, what is the song that takes you somewhere you thought was gone? I will see you in the next tale. The problem with Thursday evenings was that they ended. Caruso had never before had a problem with things ending. He had built his entire operational philosophy around the principle that attachment was a liability, that the men who suffered most in his world were the ones who held on too long, to positions, to arrangements, to people. He had watched that particular weakness hollow out stronger men than him. He had made peace with impermanence early and completely and believed, for 11 years, that the peace was genuine. The Thursday evenings ended and he went back to his life and his life was what it had always been, the meetings, the territories, the careful invisible architecture of power that required constant maintenance the way a large building requires it, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, in the small unglamorous daily work of keeping something vast from quietly falling apart. He went back to that and it was sufficient. It had always been sufficient. He told himself this on a Friday morning in December, standing at the window of his apartment above Central Park while the city woke below him, and the telling had the specific quality of a statement that is repeated because it is no longer entirely believed. Victor noticed. Victor noticed everything and said almost nothing, which was the precise quality that had kept him employed for 11 years. But on a Wednesday evening when Caruso reviewed the week's schedule and said nothing about the following day, Victor said, with the careful neutrality of a man placing a single word on a surface and stepping back to observe what it did, Thursday. Caruso looked at him. Victor looked back. Caruso said, "Clear the evening after 9. Victor said, "Already done." And that was the entirety of the conversation, and both men understood exactly what had been communicated, which was that something had changed in the architecture of Caruso's weeks in a way that was now structural rather than incidental. What neither of them discussed, because it was not the kind of thing discussed in Caruso's world, was the specific nature of the risk. Vera Osei was a catering employee at the Aldrich Hotel. She lived in Brooklyn in a shared apartment. She had no protection, no awareness of the world she was sitting inside on Thursday evenings, no understanding of what Caruso's name meant in the specific rooms where it was spoken carefully. She played piano and asked questions and looked at him with attention that was genuine and unafraid, and that combination, the attention, the fearlessness, the complete absence of performance, was the most disarming thing Caruso had encountered in 11 years of operating in a world where everyone performed everything, all the time, because the performance was survival. He had not told her what he was. She had not asked directly, though he was certain she had constructed an accurate enough picture from the available evidence. The not asking was its own kind of intelligence. It said, I see it. I am choosing what to do with what I see. He respected that. He respected it in the specific way that only becomes dangerous when it tips over the line from respect into something that requires protection, and protection in Caruso's world was not a simple thing. It was a declaration. It was a target. He stood at the window above Central Park and thought about all of this with the methodical clarity he brought to operational problems, and arrived at the same place he had been arriving at for 3 weeks, which was that the methodical clarity was not helping because this was not an operational problem. This was something else entirely. And he did not yet have the vocabulary for something else entirely. But he went on Thursday. He always went on Thursday. And Vera was always at the piano. And for 2 hours, the vocabulary did not matter. It was Victor who saw it first. Not the Thursday evenings, those he had understood for weeks. What Victor saw was the morning Caruso came back from Washington D.C. and sat in the back of the car for 40 minutes without speaking, which was not unusual, and without looking at his phone, which was unprecedented. Victor had driven Caruso for 11 years. He had driven him away from hospitals and courtrooms and negotiations that had failed and negotiations that had succeeded at significant cost. He had driven him through the aftermath of decisions that Caruso never explained and Victor never asked about. He had never once seen Caruso sit in the back of a car for 40 minutes without his phone. Victor filed this information in the part of his mind reserved for things that were important and not yet fully understood. The second thing Victor saw was the photograph. It was on Caruso's desk on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the Washington trip, in a simple dark frame, positioned at the left corner of the desk where Caruso would see it from his working position without turning his head. Victor had been in that office every day for 11 years. There had never been a photograph on the desk. There had never been a photograph anywhere visible in the apartment. He recognized Rosa Caruso from the one time he had met her, briefly, when Caruso was 18 and Victor had just begun working for the family, a small woman with her son's eyes and a directness of manner that her son had inherited completely. He said nothing about the photograph. But he understood that whatever was happening on Thursday evenings at the Aldrich Hotel had reached the desk, which meant it had reached the interior, which meant it was no longer a Thursday evening arrangement but something that had moved into the permanent structure of Caruso's daily life without being announced. The third thing happened on a Friday night when Caruso was attending a function at a building in Midtown, the kind of function that did not appear on any calendar and whose attendees did not discuss having been present. A man named Greco, who ran a significant portion of the distribution network on the west side of Manhattan and had the specific social intelligence of someone who had survived in dangerous rooms for 30 years, sat beside Caruso during a break in proceedings and said, with the careful lightness of a man who had chosen his moment precisely, "I hear you've been spending time at the Aldrich." Caruso looked at him with the particular quality of stillness that in his world communicated an entire paragraph of information in the space of 2 seconds. Greco received the paragraph and adjusted. He said he only mentioned it because a man in Caruso's position spending regular evenings at a specific hotel location was the kind of consistency that other people's people noticed, and that he meant it as a courtesy, not a comment. Caruso thanked him for the courtesy. The exchange lasted 45 seconds. Afterwards, in the car, Caruso sat in silence for the full 40 minutes again, and Victor drove without speaking, and when they reached the apartment building Victor said, without being asked, "I can vary the route and the timing." Caruso said, "Do it." And then, after a pause that Victor recognized as the specific pause before something was said that cost something to say, Caruso said, "And run a quiet security assessment on a Vera Osei. Brooklyn address. Aldrich Hotel staff." Victor said, "Tonight?" Caruso said, "Tonight." He went upstairs and stood at the window above Central Park and understood with the cold clarity of a man who had been in his world long enough to know what certain decisions meant that he had just made a declaration without using any of the words that declarations required. He had asked for protection. Which meant there was something that required protecting. Which meant he had already crossed the line he had been standing at the edge of for 5 weeks. The line was behind him now. He had crossed it the moment he went back on a Tuesday that was not a Thursday. He had crossed it the moment the photograph arrived on his desk. He simply had not acknowledged it until now. He stood at the window for a long time. Then he sat down at his desk and looked at his mother's face in the photograph and thought about the fact that Rosa Caruso had always said the people who frightened her most were not the dangerous ones. They were the ones who were dangerous and didn't know yet what they were willing to become for the right person. She had been talking about his father. But she might have been talking about him. Vera was not naive. This needs to be said clearly because everything that follows requires it. She had grown up in Washington, D.C. as the daughter of a Ghanaian immigrant woman who had worked 2 jobs and raised her daughter with the specific rigorous intelligence of someone who understood that a black woman in America could not afford to be naive about anything, not once, not for a moment, not even in the small domestic moments that felt safe. Because the world had a habit of walking through doors that felt safe and reminding you that safety was a condition you maintained by constant attention, not by assumption. Vera had been paying attention to Caruso since the first Thursday. She had paid attention to the quality of silence in the corridor before he arrived, the specific emptiness that preceded him, the way foot traffic rerouted without visible instruction. She had paid attention to Victor, who appeared occasionally in the doorway with the undemonstrative competence of someone whose job was not to be seen but whose presence meant the space around Caruso was never unmonitored. She had paid attention to the things Caruso did not say, the professional categories he never named, the business associates he referenced obliquely, the decisions he described in a passive voice as if they happened to the world rather than being made by him. She had constructed a picture. The picture was accurate. She had not asked him to confirm it because confirmation was not the point. The point was what she was going to do with it. She had a conversation about this with herself that lasted approximately 2 weeks and occupied the background of most of her waking hours during that period. One half of the conversation was practical and clear-eyed and said, "You know what this is, and you know the rules of this world, and you know that the rules of this world do not bend for people who are not part of it, and you should go back to your folding keyboard in Brooklyn and your Sunday calls from your mother and your life, which is small but entirely your own." The other half of the conversation said, "He closed his eyes when you played his mother's song." That was the entirety of the other half's argument. It was not a complicated argument. It was not a particularly sophisticated argument. It was, however, the argument that kept winning. Because Vera was a musician, and musicians understood something about truth that most people had to learn slowly and incompletely, which was that the most honest moment in any performance was the moment when the performer stopped performing. And Caruso, in 5 weeks of Thursday evenings, had stopped performing exactly once. It had lasted approximately 4 bars. But it had been real in the specific complete way that real things are real, and Vera had been sitting 3 feet away when it happened, and she was not going to pretend she had not seen it. The conversation with herself reached its conclusion on a Thursday evening in mid-December, when Caruso arrived at 10:55 as usual and sat in the chair as usual and she played for 20 minutes as usual, and then she stopped playing and turned on the bench and said, without preamble, the way she said things when she had decided to say them, "I know what you do." He looked at her. She looked back. She said, "I've known since the 2nd week. I'm not asking you to explain it or defend it or change it. I'm telling you because I don't want there to be something unsaid between us that we're both aware of, because that kind of silence has a weight and I don't want to carry it." He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "And?" She said, "And I'm still here." He said, "That's not a small thing to say." She said, "I know." He said, "You understand what it means." She said, "I understand what it means." The room was very quiet. Caruso looked at her with the same expression he had worn the night he first heard the harbor song, the expression of a man confronted with something he had not planned for and was not sure he knew how to receive. But this time there was something else layered underneath it, something that Vera recognized because she had been watching for it across 5 weeks of Thursday evenings. It was relief. The relief of a man who had been carrying the weight of being known and not said so, and had just had that weight lifted by someone else's willingness to say it first. He said, after a silence that had the quality of something being decided, I had a security assessment run on you. She said, I know. He looked at her. She said, Victor is very professional, but I noticed things. He said, it wasn't. She said, I know what it was. He was quiet. She turned back to the piano. She played for another 20 minutes and he sat in the chair and neither of them said anything else that evening, and when he left he stopped in the doorway and said, without turning, next Thursday. She said, next Thursday. And the thing that had been unspoken was spoken and the thing that had been uncertain was certain, and neither of them used the words that were technically accurate because the technically accurate words were not yet required, and both of them understood this and neither of them needed to be told. Mrs. Addo called Vera on a Sunday evening in January, which was the usual time she called, except that this time the call lasted 4 hours instead of their customary 40 minutes, and at the end of it Vera sat on her bed in her Brooklyn apartment with her folding keyboard in her lap, not playing it, just holding it, looking at the wall. Mrs. Addo had told her about Caruso's visit in December. Not because she had been withholding it, she had assumed Vera knew, and when the conversation revealed she didn't, she had told her everything. The 2 hours in the small bright living room. The tea. The photographs of Rosa. The CD and the handwriting. What Rosa had said on the phone the week before she died, about the boy she was worried about wanting him to be remembered to himself someday, about the songs she hoped would carry something back to him that she couldn't deliver in person. Mrs. Addo told Vera all of it in the unhurried way she told everything, and at the end she said, I think Rosa would have liked you very much. Vera said, you think she sent him to me? Mrs. Addo was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I think things find their way when they need to. I kept that CD for 11 years not knowing exactly why. I taught you those songs not knowing exactly why. Some things travel a long road before they arrive somewhere. That doesn't mean they weren't always going somewhere. Vera sat with that after the call ended. She thought about the piano in the staging room that was listed as decommissioned and had simply been there, waiting. She thought about the night she had chosen to play the Harbor song specifically because she was tired and it was the most comforting thing she knew. She thought about the particular quality of chance that brought a man into a corridor at exactly the right moment to hear 4 bars of music that had not existed in his world for 11 years. She was not a superstitious person. She was a musician, which meant she believed in structure, in the way things were built, in the internal logic of composition. But she also believed, in the way musicians believe it, that some pieces arrived fully formed in the composer's mind without labor, and that those pieces were often the most true, as if something had simply been waiting to be heard and had chosen its moment and its instrument. She went to the piano the following Thursday with the specific stillness of a person who has understood something important and has decided what to do with the understanding. When Caruso arrived at 10:55 she turned on the bench before he had fully entered the room and she said, Mrs. Addo told me about December. He stopped in the doorway. She said, why didn't you tell me yourself? He came in. He sat down. He was quiet for a long time, in the particular way he was quiet when he was being honest with himself about something before he said it aloud. Then he said, because going to Washington was the first thing I had done in 11 years that I did for a reason I couldn't explain in operational terms. And I didn't know how to tell you something I couldn't explain. She said, you could have tried. He said, I know. She said, that's what I'm here for. And the sentence was simple and plain and contained several things simultaneously, an offer, a statement of presence, a quiet declaration dressed in practicality, and Caruso received all of them with the careful attention of a man who understood that some sentences needed to be fully felt before they could be properly answered. He said, I know. And the way he said it was different from all the other times he had said I know, because those times he had used it to close a conversation, and this time he used it to open one. It was Victor who found it. Not intentionally, he was not a man who searched through things that were not his to search. He found it because Caruso had asked him to retrieve the CD from the desk drawer one Thursday afternoon when Caruso was across town and wanted it brought to the Aldrich that evening, and when Victor opened the drawer the CD was there alongside a small notebook he had never seen before, dark green cover, the kind sold in stationery shops that have been operating in the same location for 40 years and expect to continue, and the notebook was open to a page in Rosa Caruso's handwriting. Victor closed the drawer. He took the CD. He did not mention the notebook. But he had seen the page, and what was written on it in Rosa's looping slanted hand was this, a list of songs, 12 of them, with small notations beside each one in Italian and in Neapolitan dialect, what key, what tempo, what occasion, a word or two about what each song was for. The harbor song was 7th on the list. Beside it, Rosa had written 3 words in dialect that translated roughly as, "For the one who stays." Victor delivered the CD and said nothing. But that evening, watching Caruso enter the service door of the Aldrich Hotel staging room, he thought about those 3 words, and he thought about the fact that he had worked for this man for 11 years and had watched him build something enormous and defend it alone, and that the notebook in the desk drawer was the first evidence Victor had ever encountered that Rosa Caruso had known, before she died, that her son would need someone to stay. Caruso had found the notebook 3 weeks after Washington. It had been inside a box Mrs. Addo gave him when he left, a small box of Rosa's things she had kept, things she thought should go back to him. He had not opened it until a Tuesday night sitting alone in his apartment, and when he found the notebook and understood what it was, a complete record of every song his mother knew, in her own hand, organized and annotated as if she knew they would need to survive her, he had sat with it for a very long time. He brought it to Vera on a Thursday in January. He set it on the piano beside the CD without explanation. She opened it. She read through the list slowly, running her finger along each line, reading the notations in dialect that she mostly could not translate but whose shape and care she understood immediately. These were not casual notes, these were instructions, left by a woman who understood that the people who came after her would need them. She reached the harbor song. She read the 3 words beside it. She looked at him. He had anticipated the question and had looked up the translation. He told her. For the one who stays. She looked at the notebook for a long time. Then she said, "She wrote this before she died." He said, "Yes." She said, "She knew you'd need the songs again someday." He said, "She knew me better than I knew myself." There was a long quiet. Vera's thumb was moving along the edge of the piano keys, the thinking gesture he had come to recognize, the sound of processing something that mattered enough to require her whole attention. Then she said, "She wrote them down so they wouldn't be lost." He said, "Yes." She said, "That's the bravest thing I've ever heard." He looked at her. She was not talking about the songwriting. She was talking about a mother who knew she was running out of time and spent some of it making sure her son would still have access to something beautiful after she was gone. He said, "She was the bravest person I knew." And Vera heard in that sentence the weight of 11 years of not having been able to say it to anyone, and she did not make it smaller by responding to it. She simply let it exist in the room exactly as large as it was, and then she turned to the notebook, found the first song on the list, read the notations, placed her hands on the keys, and played it. And then the second. And then the third. And Caruso sat in the chair against the wall and listened to his mother's entire songbook played back to him in order, by a woman who had learned to play it from a woman who had kept it alive for 11 years because she understood that music was not decoration. It was the thing that remained when everything else had been stripped away. And it remained now, in this room, and he let it. The conversation that changed everything happened not in the staging room but in the corridor outside it, on the last Thursday of January, at 11:43 in the evening. Vera was leaving. She had her coat on and her bag over her shoulder and she had said goodnight in the easy way she had developed for ending their Thursday evenings, no performance, no prolonged farewell, just a natural close the way a good piece of music closes, without excess. She was at the service door when Caruso said her name. Not urgently. Not with the command quality his name usually carried in other contexts. Simply. The way you say someone's name when you need them to stop for a second because there is something true that needs to be said and you have been not saying it for long enough. She stopped. She turned. He was still in the chair, but leaning slightly forward, his elbows on his knees, his tattooed hands loosely linked in front of him, his face entirely unguarded in the way it was only ever unguarded in this room. He said, "I want to tell you something." She waited. He was quiet for a moment that had the quality of a breath before a first note. Then he said, "I have spent 11 years being very good at not needing anything." He paused. Not needing anything from people. Not needing things to be different than they were. Not needing the past to be present. He paused again. "You are the first thing in 11 years that I have genuinely needed to come back to." He said it with the same quality he brought to every true thing he said, without decoration, without hedge, without looking for a particular response. He said it because it was accurate, and because accurate things deserve to be said clearly, and because he had been not saying it for 2 months and the weight of not saying it had accumulated past the point where not saying it was possible. Vera stood in the doorway with her bag on her shoulder and her coat on, and she looked at him for a long moment. She had been waiting for something in the architecture of these evenings to declare itself. She had not known what form it would take. She had not expected it to be this quiet or this plain or this exact. She said, "I know." He said, "I need you to understand what that means in my world." She said, "I understand what it means in your world." He said, "It's not simple." She said, "I'm not asking for simple." He said, "It's not safe in the way most things are safe." She said, "Caruso." He stopped. She said, "I played your mother's song into your hands without knowing it was hers. She carried it across 22 years through a woman in D.C. who taught it to a girl in Brooklyn who brought it back to you. If that is not a sufficient sign that I am supposed to be here, then I don't know what sign would satisfy you." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face, the specific movement of a man who has been holding a door closed for 11 years and has just released his hand from it. He stood up. He walked across the staging room toward her. He stopped close enough that she could see the exact geometric pattern of the tattoo on his neck, the one that caught the light, the one she had been deliberately not looking at for 2 months because looking at it carefully felt like a decision she needed to make consciously, and she had not been ready to make it consciously. She was ready now. He said, "I'm going to ask you something." She said, "Ask." He said, "Come to Brooklyn with me." She looked at him. He said, "I want to show you where she played. The apartment is different now. It's been different for 11 years. But the building is the same and the street is the same, and I want to stand on that street with you, and I want that to have happened." Vera said, "When?" He said, "Now." She looked at him for exactly the length of time it took to understand that now was not an impulsive word but a deliberate one, that he had chosen it with the same precision he chose everything, and that it meant, not after more preparation, not after more consideration, not after more weeks of Thursday evenings. Approaching something without arriving. Now. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder. She said, "Let's go." The building was on a quiet block in Carroll Gardens, 3 stories of red brick with a fire escape on the front face and a maple tree on the pavement that had grown significantly since 2005 and now reached the second-floor windows with its bare winter branches. It was close to 1 in the morning and the street was empty, and the cold was the specific clean cold of a New York January night that had stopped apologizing for itself. They stood on the pavement in front of the building and neither of them said anything for a while. Victor had driven them and was parked at the end of the block, far enough that the distance was respectful and close enough that the distance was not abandonment, which was the specific calibration of someone who had been doing this job for 11 years and understood its requirements completely. Caruso looked at the building the way he had told Vera he had looked at the empty apartment, for exactly as long as was survivable. Then he looked slightly longer. She stood beside him, not touching him, not speaking, simply present in the way she had been present across 13 weeks of Thursday evenings, offering her attention without condition, without requirement, without asking for anything in return except the same quality of presence that she gave. He said, she would walk down these steps every Sunday morning to get the bread. He said, the bakery is 2 blocks that way. He said, I used to watch her from the second-floor window and think she was unreasonable about bread. He stopped. He said, I would give a great deal to watch her do it one more time. Vera said nothing. She knew this was not a sentence that needed a response. It needed a witness, which she was. He reached into the pocket of his coat and brought out the CD case. He held it in his tattooed hand in the cold and looked at his mother's handwriting on the inside of the cover in the yellow light of the street lamp. He said, she used to say that a song was just air moving, but that what it moved through, the specific path it cut through a room, that path stayed, even after the song was finished. That it was invisible but real. Like a current in water. Vera looked at him. She said, the thing that remains. He said, yes. A long quiet. The maple tree moved slightly in a current of cold air and its bare branches made a sound like very soft rain. Vera took her right hand out of her coat pocket. She placed it in Caruso's left hand, the one not holding the CD case, the tattooed one, the one she had been not touching for 13 weeks. He looked down at their hands. Then he closed his fingers around hers and they stood on the Carroll Gardens pavement in front of the building where Rosa Caruso had played piano every Sunday morning, and the cold was the specific clean cold of a night that was asking nothing of either of them except that they be present in it, which they were completely. After a long while, Vera said, "Play me the one she taught you first." He looked at her. He said, "I don't play." She said, "I know. I'm not asking you to play. I'm asking you to sing it." He was quiet. He said, "I haven't sung it since I was a child." She said, "I know." She said, "Start with the first 4 bars. The way she played it. Like something beginning." He looked at the building for a long moment. Then he looked at Vera. Then he looked at the sky above Carroll Gardens, where the light pollution of New York blurred the stars into a general amber warmth that was not quite darkness and not quite light but something in between that felt, in this specific moment, on this specific pavement, exactly correct. He opened his mouth. And he sang. 4 bars. Quiet and rough in the way untrained voices are rough, without technique, without performance, with nothing except the bare original truth of a song learned at a kitchen table in this building from a woman who played it every Sunday morning like something beginning. Vera held his hand and listened. When he finished, the silence that followed was not empty. It was the particular fullness of a silence after something real has been said, the silence that is actually the sound of something arriving. He looked at her. She looked at him. She said, "She would have liked that you still knew it." He said, "I know." And for the 13th time in 13 weeks, those 2 words carried more than their literal meaning. They carried everything he had not yet found the larger words for, which was fine, because the larger words were not required. They were present in the harbor song and in the notebook with 12 songs annotated in a dead woman's hand and in a photograph in a dark frame on a desk and in a scratched CD held together with tape and in 2 hands on a Carroll Gardens pavement at 1 in the morning in January while the maple tree moved and the amber sky held its warmth above them and the building stood exactly as it had stood when a small woman with strong opinions about bread walked down its steps every Sunday morning while her son watched from the 2nd floor window and thought she was unreasonable. She had not been unreasonable. She had simply understood, the way she understood everything, that the right thing was worth the distance it required. Caruso understood this now. He had been walking toward it for 13 weeks across a distance measured not in blocks but in the specific territory between a man who has buried something and the man who has finally agreed to let it surface, slowly, in a staging room on Thursday evenings, through the hands of a woman who carried it without knowing she was carrying it. He was not that first man anymore. He was not entirely sure yet who the second man was. But he was standing on the correct street in the correct borough with the correct person and the harbor song was in the air between them and behind them and ahead of them, running the specific invisible path his mother had described, not disappearing, not ending, only moving, through every room it had ever been played in, through every hand that had ever carried it, through every year it had been kept alive by people who understood that some things deserved to continue. The thing that remains. That was what she had called it. And it had remained. And now it was here, on a January pavement in Carroll Gardens, in the voice of a man who had not sung for 20 years, held in the hands of a woman who had not known what she was carrying until it arrived exactly where it was supposed to go. And if you have ever loved something you believed was gone, if you have ever stood on the street where something used to be and felt it still present, impossible and real, then you know this story did not end on this pavement. It began here. The way his mother always played it. Like something beginning. Subscribe now, hit the bell, and share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that the things we lose have a way of finding us back, through the most unexpected hands, at the most unexpected hour, in the most unexpected room. Comment below and tell me, what is the thing in your life that remained? I will be reading every single one. I will see you in the next tale.